Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and it's a while since we've had a big Brexit bust up regarding Northern Ireland. It's about time we had another one, isn't it? So, and this could be the first one, I think, since Labour took office in Westminster. The government are now going to be forced into making a choice where there isn't really a compromise. And the obvious way to prevent more Brexit divisions will actually be to align with the EU. But first, for daily political commentary, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out. So the EU have set new rules to make labelling on chemicals clearer. That sounds good. Only because we're no longer maintaining the same standards as the EU, this is causing a problem in Northern Ireland. So in order to retain access to the single market, Northern Ireland has to adopt EU standards to negate the necessity for a trade border inside the island of Ireland. But Unionists, and most especially the DUP, are not very keen on a trade border between Britain and Northern Ireland, but none at all inside Ireland. Because that would make it easier for Northern Ireland to do business with the rest of Ireland than it would be for Britain. And the DUP especially represent unionists who don't simply want to remain part of the UK. They often actively like to distance themselves from the rest of Ireland as well. So not only... And this is the DUP have got absolutely no right to complain about anything because they campaigned for Brexit. The fact that they were thick enough to think it would create a Good Friday Agreement breaking border inside Ireland as opposed to inside the UK is no excuse. But anyway, in order to calm ruffled feathers, last year, Rishi Sunak agreed as part of his Windsor framework, with the updating the Brexit deal with the EU, the so-called Stormont break. Now, it means that if a new EU rule is likely to have a significant impact on everyday life in Northern Ireland and in a way that's liable to persist, then MLAs can ask the UK government to veto the new rule, basically. Now, it only needs a third of MLAs as long as it's across at least two parties to request the break. So it doesn't need anywhere near a majority, and this has now happened. Unionist MLAs have banded together to request the break on the basis that because British producers are unlikely to want to create a separate label for their products going to Northern Ireland, that some of them will just stop supplying the market altogether. Now, there are two sides to this, really. First is the likelihood that this would be a major issue, because if it's not going to be a major issue, this is actually quite easy. Just go, no, we're not doing the break. But the second is the political dimension, which where Northern Ireland's concern is always tricky. In terms of how big an issue this is really, I can't really get reliable information. So let's go through, what would be the factors. So think about producers who export to the EU anyway. They will have to change their labelling to meet the EU standards. So that's not a problem. They will have no problem supplying Northern Ireland in the future. And even if there are British producers who only supply the UK market, their labelling may already meet the new standards anyway. And if it doesn't, they may sell enough to Northern Ireland to make it worth their while just adopting the new labelling. Remember, they don't have to have two sets. We're not talking about two sets of label, one for selling to the British market, one to the Northern Irish market. Because the new EU rules, if you adopted them, the standards, it's just about fonts and sizing of letter just to make the labels clearer, right? If you adopted those, they would still be fine for the British market. So you still only need one label. It's just that you may have to go through the cost of changing that label. So it may well be that as long as you sell enough to Northern Ireland, that it's worth just changing the label and you can still sell to Northern Ireland. It's not a problem. And we may match those same standards in the future anyway. It future-proofs you for the British market. So although in theory this could prevent Northern Ireland being able to buy certain chemicals, which would be a big issue, unless, of course, you can just get them from a supplier in the single market, in which case all of a sudden it's not a big issue. But the Unionists won't like that because they'll be buying from the EU and not Britain, right? But the reality is it may not be a problem at all. The problem, I cannot actually find any reports answering that basic question. I mean, at the drop of the hat, journalists will tell you that the Britain-Northern Ireland trade in chemicals is worth £1 billion a year. But I haven't seen any of them saying how much of that is really at risk as a result of this new rule, which, after all, just requires that labels are clearer. Like I say, some labels may be fine anyway. And the easiest way to deal with this, of course, would be for the Westminster government to say, look, clearer labelling on chemicals, that's probably in everyone's interest. And so it's the sort of rule that has merits, whether the EU were doing it or not. A clear-cut case of where we should just do the same as the EU, and then there's no problem. And if, as Labour have been saying for a while, we just align all of the standards that we have on things that we trade with the EU, then this issue need never come up again. However, I suspect that this is probably something the Conservatives should have done, didn't, and so Labour are going to have to make this decision because there isn't enough time to get that alignment now. Because part of the Stormont break requires, so MLAs can't just go, oh, there's a new rule, we don't like it. There's 30 of us across 2 different parties, we're going to ask the UK government to veto it. Doesn't work like that. They're supposed to show, this is supposed to be a last resort. So they're supposed to show that they've engaged in conversations, including with the UK government, to try and find a workaround. So I'm guessing a lot of that, if assuming that they're applying the brake correctly, has already been happening either with the Conservative government or since the Labour government. So what are the political consequences of each decision? Well, if the government don't agree to apply the brake, that's obviously going to piss off Unionists, with the most annoyed being the very ones who backed Brexit but refused to accept responsibility for that. How much they annoy them, I suppose, depends on the reasoning and what Labour do about it. I suppose that if we say that we will just adopt the same standards because it's in the interest of British consumers as well, then the annoyance may be short-term and need not cause a major row. But will we decide to adopt the same standards? And if so, how soon will they be implemented? Because if it goes for like a year where the new rules are in place, but there are a significant number of British suppliers who can't supply Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland's not going to do without those chemicals. They'll just get them from somewhere else. And then once that supply chain has been established, they'll maintain it even once we adapt the same standards, right? So it does, it depends on how expensive the relabelling would be for British chemical producers as well. If the government do agree to apply the brake, then that's an admission that divergent standards with the EU causes a major impact to people's lives. So there's people like me going to be making a bit of a fuss. Applying the brake will also be something that I imagine causes friction with the EU, who are already sacrificing a bit of integrity of the single market in the interests of maintaining the peace deal in Ireland. At a time when our negotiating strategy with the EU has been called into question, the last thing we need is to be creating a problem for UK-EU relations. Not that it's a simple case of the government either rejects the brake or applies it. The government can reject the brake. But if, we're talking about, specifically, this is Hilary Benn, Northern Ireland Secretary. But because it has wider implications, he will obviously be discussing it with other senior members of the government. If he decides that there's merit in the request, then, it gets passed on to the UK-EU Joint Committee, which obviously includes EU-appointed members. And the entire process takes quite a long time. Personally, I would just hope that the government say, look, this is going to take time. The new rule's actually quite a good one, so we'll just adopt it for ourselves. It will take time to come into force, but not much more time than going through the tedious process of applying the brake. But like I say, there will be the extra costs potentially faced by the British chemical industry to consider. Although reports say that people are not sure how the government are going to go on this one, implying that the arguments are finely balanced. Surely it comes down to this. So apply the brake, you're creating hassle with the EU at a time when the government is trying to prioritise better EU relations. Don't apply the brake and you piss off Unionists unless you can say that we're going to adopt the same standards, in which case you may add to the costs of the chemical industry in Britain at a time when the economy is already quite fragile and the government are not too keen to add extra costs to businesses right now. And because I can find no information about just how much of British chemical production this new rule really affects and how much it would cost to align it, it might be a lot, it might be bog all. I really don't know. And therefore, I don't know how to judge the likelihood. But what I do know is this. If we just dynamically align standards with the EU on everything where we have common trade, issues like this will never happen again. And the rules are in our interests as consumers as well. Who doesn't want clearer labelling on chemicals? But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, please click the like button and subscribe for further content. If you'd like to support the channel further, you can click the join button for memberships. Thanks for watching. And until next time, I'll see you later.